Thank you, Michael, for those kind words. Thank you all for coming here today to be at the launch of Joan's fourth book. The third generation is the fourth book that Joan has now written. The other two books are set in South Africa, which is called The Scent of Oranges and The Elephant's Footprint. There's also a third book on all subjects, depression. As many of you might know, Joan is a psychologist, so she wrote the book to help her clients, and soon it will be updated and brought up to date so we can bring in all the things about the internet and all that sort of thing driving everybody crazy. So without much ado, I'd like to introduce you to the person who's going to launch the book this afternoon, and that is Rabbi Yaakov Glasman, who's the President of the Rabbinical Council of Victoria. He's also a Melbourne person, like many of us. He's the Chief Rabbi of the St Kilda Hebrew congregation, and you will soon hear an excellent public speaker. He has a keen interest in education and conflict management, and is a passionate advocate of interfaith dialogue. His synagogue is often visited by many schools of various faiths as a means of building bridges for all members of the community of Melbourne. He has a wide spectrum of knowledge and understanding of religion and all the cultures that make up the religions of Melbourne. So without much ado, I'd like to present Rabbi Yaakov Glasman.
Thank you kindly, Jaime, for your wonderfully warm introduction. I don't know where you got all that information from. It wasn't me. They tell the story about a writer who spent his entire career writing, and he reached the ripe old age of 120, which in Jewish tradition is the number of years one wishes upon another person to live in happiness and in health, of course, because Moses, the greatest Jewish leader, lived until 120. He reaches that year, he departs this world, and off he goes, his soul ascends heavenward. And as he gets there, the ministering angel comes to greet him, and he says, listen, you're a writer, so there's two options for you. There's upstairs, heaven, and downstairs, the opposite of heaven. Would you like to take a guided tour of both? He says, I'd love to. So first he shows him downstairs, takes him downstairs, and he walks into this dingy, dusty, very enclosed environment, very claustrophobic, and he looks around and he sees a whole sea of people chained to a computer, writing and typing and typing and writing. And he said, oh my goodness, this is terrible. No light, no sunshine, no trees, no grass. He thought, this is a terrible, terrible place to spend eternity. So he says to the angel, listen, I appreciate the guided tour, but I want to go upstairs if that's okay. He says, look, you're a good writer. You've done a lot of good in this world. You're welcome to go upstairs. So he goes upstairs, and he goes up, and he walks into the room, and lo and behold, a dark, dusty, dingy, claustrophobic, very, very squashed environment. And he looks across and he sees seas of people sitting chained with their feet to a desk in front of the computer, typing, typing, typing away. No windows, no air, no plants, no sun, no nothing. So he turns to the angel and he says, look, there must be some mistake over here. We were just in the downstairs department, and there was, it looked exactly as it did up here. So what's the difference? And the angel turned to him and says, it's one very simple difference. Upstairs they get published. Indeed, writing is a labor. It is a labor that is difficult even at the best of times, but it is a labor of love when it's enjoyed, and especially when it comes from someone who is articulate and has a deep understanding of human nature, of the psyche, of our emotions, of our construct and the way we operate and function and interact between people. Joan was not a born writer per se. Joan is a psychologist, and an excellent one at that. And I've had dealings with her, not in a professional capacity, but I've dealings with her in discussing areas of psychology. At one point, she was so kind enough to have aided and assisted me in a particular community project, utilizing her skills on a pro bono basis, which was very much appreciated at the time. But on top of that, Joan, as she writes, or as it is written in her own about Joan, about the author, tried her hand at writing. 4 books later, here we are. And it's a wonderful, wonderful testament to her as not just a psychologist, but also as a writer. And yet the reason I emphasize her degree in psychology and her practice for many years as such is because when navigating the book, when going through the emotional roller coaster that Ella has gone through, all of the feelings, the highs and the lows, her initial disappointment when arriving to Melbourne, the unfamiliarity with her surroundings, the ups and the downs, the friendships that she made, her changing relationship with Luke, her somewhat stagnant relationship with Richard, and so on. The way in which it's described, you can tell that it's not just a writer. There is a psychologist behind that computer who's chained there. And it was with delight, especially when you actually know the writer personally, as I have known Joan for many years in my role as Rabbi of the Northeastern Jewish Center. So, if you don't mind, I would like to perhaps talk a little bit to the book, and of course afterwards I'll introduce Joan as our keynote speaker. But when we look at the book, every individual who reads the same book will perceive it in a different way, depending on their personal background, their upbringing, their personal dispositions, their professional work, and so on and so forth. And as a congregational rabbi, I was reading the book from the perspective of Judaism. It is fascinating to watch the stark contrast that exists between Ella's, as you call it, her first life and her next life, after she discovers her roots and after it becomes so close and part of her. I was once at a wedding, and the speaker, when it came time for the groom to speak to the audience, he said something that I found so remarkable, so incredibly remarkable, that it stuck with me until this day. This was a young man who was brought up in a non-religious home, a Jewish boy, but he came from quite a non-observant background. In his teens, he began to search in his own backyard to his Jewish roots, and eventually he was what we call chozer b'teshuvah. He returned to the faith. He became more religiously observant by studying all of the Torah and all of the commentaries that he had missed out on as a child, and eventually he became a full-fledged religious Jew, as it were, as was his bride. The vast majority of his friends were not so. His parents were not so. All of his colleagues were not so, and most of them were Jewish. He stood at the podium, turned to the audience, and said, I remember it vividly, he said, I know that to many of you, you think that I've changed. You think that I'm no longer the same. I speak to parents whose children have that metamorphosis, they become more religious, and they often think that their children are going through a phase. One woman once commented to me about her son, who had become more religiously observant. She said, well, at least he didn't get involved in cults or in drugs. They look at it as a kosher form of strangeness, as it were. And he was fully cognizant of the way that people were perceiving his transition in his lifestyle. So he turned to his friends, to his family, at the most public and joyous day of his life, and he said, I know that many of you think I've changed, but I haven't. I've simply discovered something that was already existent within me, and I've allowed that to cultivate within. And those words kept ringing in my mind when I was reading Ella's story. Because if you look at the original parts of her, I guess, resistance against religion, she so often describes that it almost implies that deep, deep down she sensed that there was something not quite right. I mean, initially, when you look at her first reaction to receiving a letter from Rabbi Rabinovich, that was the rabbi of the Northeastern Center, the Northeastern Shul, which I thought was quite cute because, listen, there was no Rabbi Rabinovich serving there, and if there was, I didn't know anything about him. But I kept thinking of myself as that Rabbi Rabinovich because you always read it through the lens through which you're looking at it. And when she notices the postman, as you recall, and chases after him, and she wants that package thinking it's something other than a letter from a rabbi. She never thought she'd be getting a letter from a rabbi that she never met. And her initial response she says, after having received the rabbi from that northeastern synagogue, their closest shul, which was a formal welcome of Melbourne on behalf of himself and the board of management, the congregation, mapping out the schedule of events and activities at the shul, at the synagogue. And she says, my initial impulse was to tear it up. She wanted to tear it up because she had this sense of resistance from her religion. But I stopped myself. She couldn't bring herself. She obviously sensed that her husband Richard may have had something to do with it, which indeed he did. But she didn't bring herself to actually tear up the letter. And yet her distance from her own religion was so apparent in the beginning of her journey. Later on, when she finally meets her friend Ruth, who was lovely to her, and Ruth and her husband Paul obviously bring her a little bit closer to the religion, Ruth says the two words which most Jewish people know, and many non-Jewish people as well, which is Chag Sameach. Everyone knows Chag Sameach because those are the words one says when they come to shul on the festivals. And it's even interesting that even Jews who prefer to come to shul only once or twice a year, sometimes only once a year, those are the words that ring off the tongue. You know, it's always courteous of the rabbi at the end of the services and the festival to stand in front of the congregation and to welcome each and every person as they come by. And they say Chag Sameach with a smile. And my new congregation, especially with all of the people that I hadn't yet met, is a very large congregation, and my cheeks were hurting so much, and my throat after saying Chag Sameach to 1,000 people as they were walking out. But they all know Chag Sameach. And the famous line as it goes is the people who come to shul regularly, every Shabbat, on the Chagim, when they come, on the festivals, they accidentally say Shabbat Shalom, because that's what they're used to. But the ones who come only once a year, when they come on a Shabbat for an Ofruf or a Bar Mitzvah, they'll say Chag Sameach, because that's what they're used to saying, even though it's not actually a Chag, it's rather a Shabbat. And yet that phrase, Chag Sameach, to which Ella could not connect, she sensed that there was something in it. The phrase Chag Sameach, she says, echoed within me, and I repeated it again and again. The following day, she accepted the invitation that she should kindly receive from Ruth, but she realized that how would she cope with a meal at a religious home? She didn't have a clue about the Jewish religion, and yet those words, the Chag Sameach, resonated within her mind. She couldn't let them go. So there was something gnawing inside her, at least that's what I picked up from her journey within the book, something that was very, very deep-seated, and something that wouldn't depart and eventually found its way to the forefront of her consciousness later on through her journey. When she speaks about her first shul experience, going into shul, not understanding at all what the synagogue service was about, not understanding anything, it was all entirely foreign to her. It speaks once again of her distance from her religion and her lack of knowledge and her complete ignorance with respect to that. And of course, later on, when Ruth and Paul bring over a mezuzah, every Jewish home has a mezuzah. Even a home who may not be entirely religious or even minimally religious will have a mezuzah on the door, albeit for traditional reasons. They hadn't bought one from Vienna. Even Richard sort of comments and mutters, as I recall, tangentially, "Oi, the mezuzah, I forgot the mezuzah." So it shows in what a distant place they were at that venture in their lives. And then, of course, what really, I guess, touched me, and I guess in a sense of just how far they had come, is as follows. Many Jewish people, in my experience and interactions with them, even if they themselves choose not to embrace their own religion, as soon as the baby comes along, their children, all of a sudden, they go to shul, they contact the rabbi, they want the circumcision, they want to name the girl in shul, etc. So it's the children that one bears that often brings them back to their religion. You know, they say the rabbi's role consists of three things: hatch, match, and dispatch, right? We hatch them when they're born, the bris or the naming, we match them to find a good shidduch, to match, to get married, and eventually they leave this world, we dispatch them.